They need not have worried. The weather was perfect. Warm, and without a cloud in the sky. The gardener had been at work since dawn, cutting and brushing the lawns, until the green grass shone. And the roses were wonderful. Hundreds of flowers had opened during the night. You could almost believe that the roses knew about the garden party. While the Sheridan girls were having breakfast, the men came with the marquee. "Where shall we put the marquee, Mother?" asked Meg. "My dear child, please don't ask me. I'm determined to make you children organize everything this year. Forget that I am your mother. Pretend I'm one of your guests." But Meg could not possibly talk to the men. She had just washed her hair. Josie, as usual, wasn't even dressed yet. "You'll have to go, Laura. You're the artistic one in this family." Laura flew out of the house, still holding a piece of bread and butter in her hand. Food always tasted delicious out of doors, and Laura loved arranging things. She always felt that she could do it better than anyone else. 4 men were waiting on the garden path. They were carrying big bags of tools, and looked very serious. Laura wished she had left her bread and butter in the house. She blushed and tried to look businesslike. "Good morning," she said, copying her mother's voice. But it sounded so silly that she was ashamed, and asked, just like a little girl, "Oh, have you come? Is it about the marquee?" "That's right, miss," said the tallest of the men. He pushed back his hat and smiled down at her. His smile was so friendly that Laura felt better immediately. What nice eyes he had. Small, but a lovely dark blue. All the men were smiling now. "Cheer up, we won't bite," they seemed to be saying. How very nice workmen were. And what a beautiful morning. She mustn't mention the morning. She must be businesslike. The marquee. "Well, shall we put it on the lawn over there?" She pointed with the hand that was not holding the bread and butter. They all turned and stared. The tall man frowned. "I don't like it," he said. "You wouldn't notice it there. You see, with a thing like a marquee, you want it where it hits you. Bang in the eye, as you might say." Laura had been brought up in a way which made her wonder for a moment whether a workman should use an expression like bang in the eye to her. But she understood what he meant. "A corner of the tennis court?" she suggested. "But the band's going to be in one corner." "Having a band, are you?" said another workman. He was pale, with a tired look in his dark eyes. What was he thinking? "Only a very small band," Laura said gently. Perhaps he wouldn't mind a very small band. But the tall man said, "Look here, miss. That's the place. By those trees. Over there." By the karaka trees. The marquee would hide them. And the karaka trees were so lovely, with their big, shiny leaves and orange fruit. Must they be hidden by a marquee? They must. The men were already carrying their bags of tools across the lawn. Only the tall man was left. Suddenly, he bent down, touched a rose, and pulled it gently towards him to smell it. When Laura saw him do that, she forgot about the karacas. He was a workman who loved the perfume of roses. How many of the men that she knew cared about things like that? Oh, how nice workmen are, she thought. Why couldn't she have them for her friends, instead of the silly boys she danced with and who came to Sunday night's supper. She liked these men much better. It's all the fault, she decided, of these stupid differences in social class. Well, for her, there were no differences. Absolutely none at all, not a single one. And now there came the sound of hammers. Someone whistled. Someone called out, "Are you all right, mate?" Mate! How friendly they were! Just to show how happy she was, how she liked being among these friendly men, Laura took a big bite out of her bread and butter. She felt just like a work girl. "Laura! Laura! Where are you? Telephone, Laura!" a voice cried from the house. "Coming!" She ran across the lawn, up the path, and into the house. In the hall, her father and Laurie were brushing their hats, getting ready to go to the office. "I say, Laura," said Laurie, "take a look at my coat, can you, before this afternoon? I think it needs ironing." "All right," she said. Suddenly, she couldn't stop herself. She ran up to Laurie and threw her arms around him. "Oh, I do love parties, don't you?" she cried. "I'll say I do," said Laurie's warm, boyish voice. He gave his sister a gentle push. "Run off to the phone, old girl." The telephone. Yes, oh yes. Kitty? "Good morning, dear. Come to lunch, my dear." "It will be nothing special, just what's left over." "Yes, isn't it a perfect morning?" "Yes, wear your white dress." "One moment, Mother is saying something." Mrs. Sheridan's voice floated down the stairs. "Tell her to wear that sweet hat she wore last Sunday." "Mother says you must wear that sweet hat you wore last Sunday." "Good. 1 o'clock. Bye-bye." Laura put down the phone, took a deep breath, and stretched out her arms. Then she stood still, listening. The house was alive with sounds of running feet and distant voices. Somewhere down in the kitchen, a door opened and closed. Sunlight and little warm winds played in and out of the windows. Darling little winds. The doorbell rang, and she heard a man's voice, and then Sadie saying, "I'm sure I don't know. Wait, I'll ask Mrs. Sheridan." "What is it, Sadie?" Laura came into the hall. "The flowers have come from the shop, Miss Laura." And there they were, by the door. Box after box, full of pots of pink lilies. No other kind. Nothing but lilies. Big pink flowers, wide open and almost frighteningly alive. "Oh, Sadie," said Laura. She bent down to touch them, half expecting the flowers to burn her fingers. "It must be a mistake," she said softly. "Nobody ever ordered so many. Sadie, go and find Mother." But at that moment, Mrs. Sheridan appeared. "It's quite right," she said calmly. "I ordered them. Aren't they lovely?" She touched Laura on the arm. "I was passing the shop yesterday, and I saw them in the window. I thought, for once in my life, I shall have enough lilies. The garden party will be a good excuse." "But I thought that we children had to organise everything this year," said Laura. Sadie had gone, and the man from the flower shop was outside. She put her arm around her mother's neck, and gently, very gently, she bit her mother's ear. "My darling child, you wouldn't like me to be a sensible mother, would you? Don't do that. Here's the man. He was carrying in another box of lilies. "Put them here, please, on either side of the door," said Mrs. Sheridan. "Don't you agree that they'll look best there, Laura?" "Oh, yes, Mother." In the sitting room, Meg, Josie, and little Hans were arranging the furniture. "Now, we should put the piano here and move everything else except the chairs out of the room, don't you think?" "Exactly. Hans, move these tables into the smoking room and then brush the carpet and—" "One moment, Hans." Josie loved giving orders to the servants, and they loved obeying her. She made them feel that they were all acting together in some exciting play. "Tell Mother and Miss Laura to come here at once." "Very good, Miss Josie." She turned to Meg. "I want to hear what the piano sounds like, in case I have to play this afternoon." Pom-ta-ti-ta-ti-ta. At the sound of the piano, Josie's face changed. She looked with eyes full of suffering at her mother and Laura as they came in. "This life is weary," she sang. "A tear, a sigh, a love that changes, and then goodbye." But on the word goodbye, although the piano sounded desperately sad, a big, bright, completely unsympathetic smile appeared on Josie's face. "Aren't I singing well today, Mummy?" she said happily, and started to sing again. "This life is weary, hope comes to die, a dream." But Sadie had come in. "What is it, Sadie?" "Please, Miss Josie, Cook says she needs the flags for the sandwiches." "The flags for the sandwiches, Sadie," Mrs. Sheridan said in a dreamy voice, and the children knew by her face that she hadn't got them. "Let me see. Tell Cook I'll get them to her in 10 minutes. Sadie went. "Now, Laura," said her mother quickly, "come with me into the smoking room. I've got the names on the back of an envelope. You'll have to write them on the flags for me. Meg, go upstairs and brush your hair. Josie, go and dress immediately. Quickly, children, or I shall have to speak to your father about you. And Josie, if you go into the kitchen, try and calm Cook down, will you? I'm quite frightened of her this morning." Mrs. Sheridan found the envelope and told Laura what to write on the flags for the sandwiches. "Chicken and banana. Have you done that one?" "Yes." "Egg and—" Mrs. Sheridan held the envelope away from her. "Fish. Can this possibly say fish?" "Yes, Mother dear," said Laura, looking over her shoulder. "Fish? It sounds absolutely horrible. Egg and fish." The flags were finished at last, and Laura took them to the kitchen. Josie was there talking to the cook, who looked perfectly calm and cheerful. "I've never seen such beautiful sandwiches," Josie was saying enthusiastically. "How many kinds are there?" 15, Miss Josie." "Well, Cook, I congratulate you." Cook smiled happily. "Godber's has come," said Sadie. She meant that the man from Godber's shop had brought the chocolate cakes. Godber's chocolate cakes were famous. Nobody ever made their own if they could buy Godber's. "Bring them in and put them on the table, my girl," ordered Cook. Sadie brought them in and went back to the door. Of course, Laura and Josie were far too grown up to care about chocolate cakes. All the same, those cakes looked nice. Very nice. Cook began arranging them on plates. "Don't they remind you of all the parties we had when we were children?" said Laura. "I suppose they do," said Josie, who never liked to think about the past. "They look delicious, I must say." "Have some, my dears," said Cook in her comfortable voice. "Your ma won't know." Oh, impossible! Chocolate cake, and so soon after breakfast. It was unimaginable. All the same, 2 minutes later, Josie and Laura were licking chocolate off their fingers. "Let's go into the garden," suggested Laura. "I want to see how the men are getting on with the marquee. They're such awfully nice men." But the door was blocked by Cook, Sadie, Godber's man, and Hans. Something had happened. Cook was making little sounds. Sadie had her hand over her mouth. Hans was trying so hard to understand that his eyes were closed tight. Only Godber's man was enjoying himself. It was his story. "What's the matter? What's happened?" "There's been a horrible accident," Cook said. "A man's been killed." "A man killed? Where? How? When?" But Godber's man wanted to tell the story.
"You know those little cottages just down the road from here, miss?"
Of course she knew them.
"Well, there's a young fellow living there. Scott, he's called. He's got a horse and cart. Something frightened the horse in town this morning. The cart turned over, and this fellow Scott was thrown out. He fell in the road on the back of his head. Killed."
"Dead?"
Laura stared at Godber's man. "Dead when they picked him up," Godber's man said with enjoyment. "They were taking the body home as I was coming here." Then he said, "He's left a wife and 5 little ones."
"Josie, come here." Laura took her sister's hand and pulled her across the kitchen and through the door. "Josie," she said, "how can we stop everything?" "Stop everything, Laura?" cried Josie. "What do you mean?" "Stop the garden party, of course." Why did Josie pretend not to understand? But Josie was even more surprised. "Stop the garden party? My dear Laura, don't be unreasonable. Of course we can't stop the party. Nobody expects us to. Don't be so silly." "But we can't possibly have a garden party with a man dead just outside the front gate." That really was silly, because the Sheridans' house was on a hill, and the cottages were right down at the bottom of the hill. There was a wide road between them. True, they were still much too near. They were not suitable neighbours for people like the Sheridans. The cottages were ugly little low brown things. Nothing but rubbish grew in their gardens. Even the smoke coming from their chimneys looked poor and mean. The people who lived in them lived by washing other people's clothes, or mending shoes, or cleaning chimneys, and they all had far too many children. When the Sheridan children were little, they were not allowed to go near the cottages in case they heard bad language or caught some awful disease. But now that they were grown up, Laura and Laurie sometimes walked past. It was dirty and unpleasant, but Laura and Laurie believed that they should experience all sides of life. They must go everywhere. They must see everything. "Think how that poor woman will feel if she hears a band playing," said Laura. "Oh, Laura!" Josie began to be seriously annoyed. "If you want to stop a band every time someone has an accident, you're going to have a very difficult life. I'm just as sorry about it as you are." A hard look came into her eyes. She looked at her sister in the way she had looked when they were little girls fighting together. You won't bring a drunk workman back to life by stopping a party, she said softly. Drunk? Who said he was drunk? Laura said angrily. She said, just as she had done when she was little, I'm going to tell Mother. Please do, my dear, said Josie sweetly. Mother, can I come into your room? Said Laura, standing with one hand on her mother's door. Of course, child. Why, what's the matter? You look quite pink. Mrs. Sheridan turned from her mirror. She was trying on a new hat. Mother, a man's been killed, Laura began. Not in our garden, said her mother. No, no. Oh, how you frightened me. Mrs. Sheridan took off the big hat and smiled at her daughter. But listen, Mother, said Laura. Breathlessly she told the awful story. Of course we can't have our party, can we? She said. The band and everybody arriving. They'd hear us, Mother. They're nearly neighbours. To Laura's great surprise, her mother behaved just like Josie. It was worse, because she seemed to be amused. She refused to take Laura seriously. But my dear child, be sensible. We only know about the accident by chance. If someone had died there normally, and I don't know how they keep alive in those dirty little holes, we'd still be having our party, wouldn't we? Laura had to agree, but she felt it was all wrong. Mother, isn't it really terribly heartless of us? She asked. Darling, Mrs. Sheridan got up, holding the hat, and before Laura could stop her, she put it on Laura's head. My child, she said, the hat is yours. It's much too young for me. You look wonderful in it. Look at yourself. And she held up a mirror. But Mother, Laura began again. She couldn't look at herself. She turned away from the mirror. This time Mrs. Sheridan became angry, just as Josie had done. You are being very stupid, Laura, she said coldly. People like that won't expect us to cancel our party, and it's not very thoughtful of you to ruin the day for everyone else. I don't understand, said Laura, and she walked quickly out of the room and into her own bedroom. There, quite by chance, the first thing she saw was a lovely girl in the mirror, wearing a beautiful black and gold hat. She had never imagined that she could look like that. Is Mother right? She thought. And now she hoped that her mother was right. Am I being stupid? Perhaps it was stupid. For a moment she imagined that poor woman again, and the little children, and the body being carried into the house. But now it seemed shadowy and unreal, like a picture in the newspaper. I'll remember it again after the party's over, she decided, and somehow that seemed to be the best plan. Lunch was over by 1:30. By 2:30, they were all ready to begin the party. The band had arrived and sat in a corner of the tennis court. My dear, screamed Kitty Maitland. Aren't they all too like monkeys in their little red jackets? Laurie arrived from the office. When she saw him, Laura remembered the accident again. She wanted to tell him about it. If Laurie agreed with the others, it meant that they were right, and she followed him into the hall. Laurie! Hello! He was halfway upstairs, but when he turned and saw Laura, he stopped and stared at her. My word, Laura! You look wonderful, said Laurie. What an absolutely topping hat!
Laura said quietly. Is it? And smiled at Laurie. She didn't tell him about the accident. Soon after that, people started to arrive. The band began to play. The hired waiters ran from the house to the marquee. Wherever you looked, there were couples walking, looking at the flowers, greeting friends, moving on over the lawn. They were like bright birds that had come to visit the Sheridans' garden for this one afternoon, on their way to... where? Ah, what happiness to be with people who are all happy, to shake hands, kiss, smile.
Darling Laura, how well you look! What a beautiful hat, child!
Laura, you look quite Spanish. I've never seen you look so lovely. And Laura, happy, answered softly. Have you had tea? Won't you have an ice cream? The coffee and brandy ice creams really are rather special. She ran to her father and begged him, Daddy, darling, can the band have something to drink? And the perfect afternoon slowly opened, slowly turned to the sun, and slowly closed like a flower.
The most enjoyable garden party. The greatest success. Quite the most delicious...
Laura helped her mother with the goodbyes. They stood side by side until all the guests had gone.
All over, said Mrs. Sheridan.
Go and find all the others, Laura. Let's go and have some fresh coffee. I'm exhausted.
Yes, it's been very successful, but oh, these parties. Why do you children insist on giving parties?
And they all sat down in the empty marquee.
Have a sandwich, Daddy dear. I wrote the flag. Thanks.
Mr. Sheridan took a bite, and the sandwich was gone. He took another.
Did you hear about a nasty accident that happened today? He said.
My dear, said Mrs. Sheridan, holding up her hand, we did. It nearly ruined the party. Laura wanted us to cancel everything.
Oh, Mother!
Laura did not want them to laugh at her.
It was a horrible thing, though, said Mr. Sheridan. The fellow was married, too. Lived in one of those cottages down there. Leaves a wife and a whole crowd of kids, they say.
There was a long silence. Mrs. Sheridan played with her cup. Really, it was most unfortunate that Father had mentioned. Suddenly, she looked up. They still had all these perfectly good sandwiches and cakes, which had not been eaten at the party. She had one of her clever ideas. I know, she said. Let's send that poor creature some of this food. We'll pack a basket. All those children will love it. And I'm sure all the neighbours are calling in. How helpful it will be for her to have some extra food ready. Laura, get me the big basket from the kitchen cupboard. But, Mother, do you really think it's a good idea? Said Laura. Again, how strange. She seemed to be different from them all. To take the leftover food from their party. Would the poor woman really like that?
Of course. What's the matter with you today? An hour or so ago you were insisting on us being sympathetic.
Oh, well. Laura ran to get the basket. Her mother heaped food into it. Take it yourself, darling, she said. Run down with it now. No, wait. Take some lilies, too. These lilies will seem like something really special to people of that kind.
She'll get her dress dirty if she takes flowers, said Josie.
That was true. Just in time. Only the basket, then. And Laura, her mother followed her out of the marquee. Whatever happens, don't...
What, Mother?
No, it was better not to put ideas into the child's head. Nothing. Run along. It was beginning to get dark as Laura shut the garden gate. Below her, the road shone white. The little cottages were in deep shadow. How quiet it seemed after the excitement of the day. She was going down to a cottage where a man lay dead, and she couldn't believe it. Why couldn't she? She stopped for a moment, and it seemed that kisses, voices, laughter, the fresh smell of the lawn, were somehow inside her. She had no room for anything else. How strange. She looked up at the pale sky, and all she thought was, yes, it was the most successful party. She crossed the wide road. She was among the cottages. Men and women hurried past. Children played in the narrow streets. Noises came from inside the mean little houses. In some there was lamplight, and shadows moved across the windows. Laura bent her head and hurried on. She wished now that she had put on a coat. People were staring at her dress and her black and gold hat. Oh, how she wished it was a different hat. It was a mistake to come here. She had known all the time that it would be a mistake. Should she go back, even now? No, too late. There was the house. It must be this one. There were people standing outside. Beside the gate, an old woman sat in a chair, watching. She had her feet on a newspaper. The voices stopped as Laura came near. They moved to one side to let her walk past. She felt that they were expecting her. They had known that she would come. Laura felt very shy and frightened.
Is this Mrs. Scott's house? She asked a woman, and the woman answered with a strange little smile.
It is, my girl. Oh, how she wanted to escape from this. She actually said out loud, "Help me, God," as she walked up the tiny path and knocked at the door. I'll just leave the basket and go, she decided. I won't even wait for them to empty it. Then the door opened. A little woman in black appeared. Laura said, "Are you Mrs. Scott?" But to her horror, the woman answered, "Come in, please, miss." And she was shut in the passage.
"No," said Laura. "I don't want to come in. I only want to leave this basket. Mother sent—"
The little woman in the dark passage seemed not to hear her. "This way, please, miss," she said in an oily voice, and Laura followed her. She found herself in a little low kitchen, lit by a smoky lamp. There was a woman sitting by the fire. "Em," said the little creature who had let her in. "Em, it's a young lady." She turned to Laura. "I'm her sister, miss," she said. "You'll excuse her, won't you?"
"Oh, but of course," said Laura. "Please, please don't disturb her. I only want to leave."
But at that moment, the woman by the fire turned round. Her face, red-eyed and wet, looked terrible. She didn't seem to understand why Laura was there. What did it mean? Why was a stranger standing in the kitchen with a basket? And more tears fell from those poor red eyes. "All right, my dear," said the sister. "I'll thank the young lady." And she gave Laura an oily smile. Laura only wanted to get out, to get away. She went out into the passage, a door opened, and she walked into the bedroom, where the dead man was lying. "You'd like to see him, wouldn't you?" said Em's sister. "Don't be afraid, my girl. He looks a picture. Not a mark on him. Come along, my dear." Laura went up to the bed. A young man lay there, asleep, sleeping so deeply that he was far, far away from them both. So distant, so peaceful. He was dreaming. Never wake him up again. His eyes were closed, deep in his dream. What did garden parties and baskets and dresses mean to him? He was far away from all those things. He was wonderful, beautiful. While they were all laughing and the band was playing, this beautiful thing had come to the cottages. Happy, happy. "All is well," said that sleeping face. "This is what should happen. I am at rest." But at the same time, it made you want to cry, and Laura couldn't go out of the room without saying something to him. She burst into tears like a little girl. "Forgive my hat," she said. And this time she didn't wait for Em's sister. She found her way out of the house, past all the people. At the corner of the street, she met Laurie. He appeared out of the shadows. "Is that you, Laura?" "Yes." "Mother was getting anxious. Was it all right?" "Yes, quite." "Oh, Laurie." She ran to him and took his arm. "I say, you're not crying, are you?" asked her brother. Laura shook her head. She was. Laurie put his arm round her shoulders. "Don't cry," he said, in his warm, loving voice. "Was it awful?" "No," said Laura. "It was absolutely wonderful. But, Laurie—" She stopped. She looked at her brother. "Isn't life—" she began. "Isn't life—" But what life was, she couldn't explain. It didn't matter. She knew he understood. "Isn't it, darling?" said Laurie.